This will feel a little weird.
Why schools suck. Why the rich stay rich. A documentary investigation into the architecture of inequality, inspired by the lectures of Professor Jiang. There is a question that almost no one wants to ask honestly. Not parents, not teachers, not politicians, not the students themselves. The question is this: why does school, an institution that consumes more of your childhood than anything else, an institution that costs societies trillions of dollars and demands the labor of millions of adults, an institution founded on the noblest of stated purposes, why does this institution, in nearly every country on Earth, produce such consistently disappointing results? And the second question, the one that follows close behind, is darker still. Why is it that no matter how hard the children of poor families work, no matter how brilliant they are, no matter how disciplined, the children of rich families tend to end up in the positions of power anyway? Why does the game appear to be rigged from the moment of birth? These are not separate questions. They are the same question, viewed from two different angles, and the answer to both, when you finally see it clearly, will change the way you look at your own life, the way you raise your children, and the way you understand every institution you have ever passed through. This is Red Pill Deep Research. What you are about to hear is a structured investigation drawn from years of analysis by Professor Jiang, whose lectures have illuminated for an entire generation the hidden game theory beneath the surface of everyday life. We have synthesized, expanded, and reorganized this material into a single continuous narrative, one designed not to entertain you, but to wake you up. By the end of this audiobook, you will understand schools, families, and societies the way the people who designed them understand them. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The three stated purposes of school. Every school in the world, from the most elite private academy in Switzerland to the most under-resourced rural classroom in central China, claims to pursue three core purposes. These purposes are written into curriculum documents, repeated in graduation speeches, printed on glossy brochures, and recited by administrators when parents come to visit. They are, on paper, beyond dispute. The first purpose is literacy, the ability to read and to write. This is the foundational skill of all civilized life, because without the capacity to absorb information and to convey information, you cannot function in a modern economy, you cannot participate in democratic life, you cannot defend yourself against fraud, you cannot pursue knowledge on your own. Literacy is the gateway. Every other intellectual achievement walks through it. The second purpose is what educators call the core competencies. These are the skills that determine whether a person can actually do anything useful with their literacy. The ability to think critically, to question assumptions, to evaluate evidence, the ability to collaborate, to work alongside others without destroying the team, the ability to communicate, to make yourself understood, and the ability to be understood by others. Creativity, the capacity to generate something new rather than merely repeat what has been done before. These are the tools of an adult mind. The third purpose, and arguably the most important in the modern age, is lifelong learning. School, in this conception, is not the end of education, but its beginning. Because every 5 years the world changes, because new technologies emerge, because old industries die, because political systems shift, because what was true yesterday becomes obsolete tomorrow, school must instill in students a love of learning itself. A graduate who hates studying is a graduate who will be unemployable within a decade. A graduate who loves studying will adapt, will grow, will thrive, no matter what the world throws at them. Three purposes: literacy, core competencies, lifelong learning. Repeat them to yourself. They are the official mission statement of the entire global educational enterprise. Now consider what actually happens. Chapter 2. The inversion. In most schools in the world today, students are not required to read books. They are not required to read books. Let that sentence land for a moment. The single most important activity for developing literacy, for developing the long attention span necessary to follow a complex argument, for developing the inner life necessary to think for oneself, is not required. When students reach university, professors find themselves in a state of quiet shock. They had assumed, naively, that the young adults arriving in their lecture halls would have read at least a few hundred books over the course of their schooling. Instead, they discovered that the new generation cannot follow a paragraph longer than 3 sentences. So the professors adjust. They shorten the readings. They replace chapters with excerpts. They replace excerpts with summaries. They replace summaries with YouTube videos. And eventually, university itself becomes a place where literacy is no longer practiced, only performed. Attention spans, measured across every developed nation, have collapsed. The average viewer of online content can sustain focus for roughly 40 seconds before reaching for another stimulus. A 1-hour lecture, the standard format of higher education for 800 years, has become physiologically intolerable for a significant portion of the population. People lose focus after 5 minutes, sometimes less. The brain has been rewired by short-form content into something that cannot do the very thing school was designed to teach. So much for literacy. Now consider collaboration. School claims to teach students how to work together, how to cooperate, how to value the contributions of others. What school actually teaches is the opposite. School teaches students that learning is a zero-sum game. For you to receive an A, someone else must receive a C. Class ranking is published. Students are sorted, ranked, compared. The implicit message, repeated thousands of times across thousands of school days, is that your classmate's failure is your opportunity. The smart student does not share notes. The smart student does not explain difficult concepts to confused peers. The smart student hoards knowledge like a miser hoards gold, because in the world that school has constructed, knowledge given away is competitive advantage surrendered. This is the exact opposite of what every actual workplace requires. In every functional company on Earth, success depends on teams, on shared knowledge, on the ability to lift up colleagues who are struggling. Schools produce graduates who have been trained for 12 years to do precisely the opposite, and then we wonder why workplaces are dysfunctional. And lifelong learning. The third and most important purpose. How does the system perform here? In China, the rite of passage is famous. After the national entrance examination, the Gaokao, students gather in their classrooms and they tear apart their textbooks. They rip out the pages. They throw the paper into the sky in great fluttering clouds of liberation. They burn them in the courtyards. The ceremony is not subtle. The message is unmistakable. I never want to read a book again. I never want to take a test again. I never want to learn again. School has taught them with crushing efficiency to hate the very activity it was designed to instill love for. This is not a Chinese phenomenon. The same dynamic plays out in different cultural costumes across the entire developed world. American high school graduates abandon reading the moment graduation ends. European students treat university as a 4-year holiday between the discipline of secondary school and the discipline of the workplace. The young people who emerge from 12 to 16 years of formal education are, in the majority, people who have learned to associate study with suffering, knowledge with punishment, and curiosity with weakness. The 3 stated purposes of school have not merely failed to materialize, they have been inverted. Schools, in the aggregate, produce illiterate, antisocial, intellectually exhausted graduates who will spend the rest of their lives avoiding the very activities that would have given them dignity. So the question becomes, why? Why does a system supposedly designed to teach reading produce non-readers? Why does a system supposedly designed to teach collaboration produce competitors? Why does a system supposedly designed to teach the love of learning produce people who burn their books? The answer is game theory. And the answer will surprise you, because the answer is not that the system is broken. The answer is that the system is working perfectly. It is simply working for a purpose other than the one printed on the brochure. Chapter 3. The Outsider. Who tried to understand the hidden purpose of school, consider the following true story. The year is 2008. A young scholar, freshly graduated from Yale, takes a position in southern China at a prestigious middle school in Shenzhen. His task is to build, from scratch, an international program that will prepare Chinese students to study abroad at the world's top universities. He arrives full of ambition. He surveys the existing situation and finds it inadequate. The students who plan to study abroad, perhaps 80 per year out of a much larger student body, are pursuing the goal with all the wrong methods. They sit in Chinese-style classrooms of 50 students taking notes, taking tests, never speaking, never debating, never questioning. They spend their evenings memorizing SAT vocabulary lists rather than reading actual books. For their extracurricular profile, every single one of them participates in Model United Nations, because that is what the older brothers and sisters did, and there is no differentiation between any applicant and any other. The young scholar redesigns everything. He institutes a seminar system, bringing in American teachers to run small classes of 10 to 20 students where books are discussed, arguments are made, ideas are challenged. He eliminates the SAT vocabulary drills and replaces them with an actual reading curriculum. He builds, with his own hands and a substantial budget, a 5,000-volume English language library inside the school so that any student at any moment can borrow a book and discover the joy of reading. For extracurricular activities, he refuses to allow another Model UN club. Instead, he establishes 2 new institutions. The first is a coffee house, the first of its kind inside a Chinese high school. Students must run it as a real business. They serve as waiters, as accountants, as marketing managers. They learn collaboration, finance, customer service, entrepreneurship, real skills with real consequences. The second is a daily student newspaper, also the first of its kind, where teenagers report stories, conduct interviews, edit copy, lay out pages, and rise at 7 in the morning to distribute the printed paper to their classmates after working until midnight or 2 in the morning the night before. He establishes a culture around 3 principles: transparency, the idea that mistakes will be openly acknowledged and corrected; innovation, the willingness to try things that have never been tried; openness, the commitment to evolve the curriculum continuously based on what actually works. The results, by every objective metric, are spectacular. Within a single semester, then a single year, the program is transformed. The students who go through it gain admission to Yale, to Wharton, to Cornell, to Dartmouth. The school becomes the most famous study abroad program in all of southern China. The coffee house and the newspaper become permanent fixtures that exist to this day, decades later, long after their founder has gone. And then comes the part of the story that nobody warns you about. He is fired. The teachers, the parents, the students, the administrators are all delighted to see him go. The word they use to describe him is not reformer. It is not visionary. It is not idealist. The word they use is dictator, and worse words besides. He is, in their collective judgment, an arrogant outsider who did not understand how things are done. He is told, plainly and finally, that he will never be permitted to design another program. He spends years trying to rebuild a similar project elsewhere and finds every door closed. Nobody wants him in management. Nobody wants him near another curriculum committee. Why? Because he succeeded. Because he proved that something better was possible. Because his success was an indictment of every administrator who had not bothered, every teacher who had been coasting, every parent who had been playing a different game. His existence inside the system was an unbearable accusation, and the system, sensing the threat, expelled him with the efficient hostility of a body rejecting a foreign organ. He had committed the cardinal sin. He had insisted on fairness. He had refused to give the children of powerful families the easy grades they expected. He had insisted that effort, not connection, determined outcomes. And in doing so, he had violated the actual rule of the actual game that the actual school was actually playing. To understand what that game is, we must now turn to the discipline that explains all human institutions. We must turn to game theory. Chapter 4. The Players. In game theory, the first step in analyzing any situation is to identify the players. The players are the stakeholders, the actors whose interests and decisions determine the outcome. You must list them honestly and completely, because if you miss a player, your analysis will fail. In a school, the players are these: the students, the parents, the teachers, the administrators, the government, and the universities to which the students hope eventually to apply. 6 categories of player, each with their own interests, their own incentives, their own constraints, their own strategies. A naive analyst, an idealistic outsider, would assume that each player wants what the brochure says they want. Let us audit those assumptions, because they are wrong, and the gap between what we assume and what is actually true is the gap into which entire civilizations fall. The naive assumption about students is that they want to learn, that they want to grow intellectually, that they want to gain admission to elite universities because elite universities offer the best education. The naive assumption about parents is that they want their children to become independent, capable, successful adults. The naive assumption about teachers is that they love teaching, that they love their subjects, that they want nothing more than the space and the freedom to inspire young minds. The naive assumption about administrators is that they want their schools to be excellent and that they will reward whatever produces excellence. The naive assumption about governments is that they want innovation, that they want a competitive workforce, that they want a strong nation built on educated citizens. The naive assumption about universities is that they want the most curious, most passionate, most talented students they can find, regardless of background. Every single one of these assumptions is false. The true principle of game theory, the iron law beneath all human behavior, is this: every player wants to achieve the maximum possible outcome with the minimum possible effort. People are lazy and people are greedy. This is not a moral judgment. It is a description. And once you accept it, the behavior of every institution on Earth becomes legible. What students actually want is to gain admission to good universities while doing as little work as possible. If working hard is required, many of them will quietly downgrade their ambition rather than increase their effort. They will tell themselves they did not really want the Ivy League anyway. What they want, more deeply, is to be popular, to have friends, to please their parents enough to keep the allowance flowing, to please their teachers enough to keep the grades acceptable. Learning, the actual acquisition of knowledge, is somewhere far down the list, often not on the list at all. What parents actually want is not the success of their children. It is the appearance of the success of their children, displayed to other parents, to relatives, to colleagues. The technical term is face. A child at Brown or Cornell or Dartmouth is a trophy to be displayed in conversation, evidence of the parent's genetic and pedagogical superiority. Whether the child is actually happy at Brown, whether the child is actually learning at Cornell, whether the child will actually flourish in the long run, are secondary considerations, sometimes non-existent ones. Parents also want control. They want children who will obey them, who will follow the plan they have laid out, who will not embarrass the family with independent thought. A child who thinks critically about her parents' choices is a threat. A child who obeys is a comfort. What teachers actually want, in the aggregate and with honorable exceptions, is to do the minimum required to collect their salary and go home to their own families. They have their own children, they have their own bills, they have their own exhausted nervous systems. They are not, in the main, secret idealists waiting for the right administrator to liberate their pedagogical genius. They are workers, doing a job, performing the tasks required to remain employed. This is not contemptible. It is human. But it is not what the brochure says. What administrators actually want is to keep powerful parents happy. Because powerful parents can have administrators fired. Powerless parents cannot. So the entire managerial calculus of a school becomes, quietly, the calculus of pleasing the wealthiest and best-connected families in the parent body. If a teacher gives the son of a powerful donor a low grade, the teacher is the problem, not the son. If a curriculum reformer threatens the comfortable status of the existing arrangement, the reformer is the problem, not the curriculum. Administrators want, above all else, the absence of complaints. They want quiet. They want to coast. What governments actually want is the absence of trouble. They speak the language of innovation and creativity because that is the language one is supposed to speak in the 21st century, but their actual operational priority is compliance. A school that produces obedient citizens who do not riot, who pay their taxes, who do not write inconvenient essays, is a good school. A school that produces critical thinkers who question the regime is a problem, regardless of how brilliant its graduates are. And universities. The universities, particularly the elite American universities to which Chinese students aspire, want one thing above all others. They want money. They will accept any student whose family is willing to pay tuition, regardless of how poorly that student speaks English, regardless of how little intellectual curiosity that student possesses, regardless of how cynical the application is. They will then perform, in their public communications, a great theater of meritocratic selectivity, talking about diversity and passion and potential. But underneath the theater, the operational rule is straightforward. Pay, and you are welcome. Bring a famous family name, and you are doubly welcome. Excellence is decorative. Now look at the list again. Look at what each player actually wants, and ask yourself, where do these interests converge? Because that point of convergence is the actual game that is actually being played. That is the school you actually attended. Chapter 5. The convergence point. When you take the real interests of all the players, the interests they would never admit aloud, and you find the place where those interests overlap, what you discover is the architecture of the modern international school. Parents want their children to attend institutions with white faces, because white faces signal foreignness, signal expense, signal status. Whether the white-faced teacher is actually competent is irrelevant. The marketing materials of these schools are dominated by photographs of foreign teachers precisely because that is what the consumer is buying. Parents want easy grades because easy grades produce the appearance of academic success without the inconvenience of academic failure. They want their child to be presented as a top student, regardless of whether the child has done top work. Teachers want to coast. Easy grading achieves this. Lenient curricula achieve this. Inflated assessments achieve this. A teacher who fails students invites complaints, conferences, confrontations. A teacher who passes everyone with a smile invites none of these things. The path of least resistance is paved with grade inflation. Administrators want the powerful parents to remain happy. Easy grades keep powerful parents happy. White faces in the marketing materials keep powerful parents happy. A handful of genuinely high-achieving students, identified early, polished, aggressively, and dispatched to brand-name universities, provides the social proof the school needs to justify its tuition. The convergence point produces a school that looks, externally, like a temple of excellence. Beautiful campus, modern buildings, multilingual website, enthusiastic admissions officers, photogenic foreign teachers, a handful of star students dispatched annually to Yale or Stanford. Internally, the same school is something else entirely. Easy grades distributed uniformly. Widespread cheating tolerated because confronting it would upset parents. High turnover of teachers who arrive idealistic and depart cynical within 2 years. High turnover of students who arrive and depart according to the shifting fortunes of their families. A handful of carefully cultivated success stories used to advertise an institution whose median product is mediocrity. This is why schools suck. Not because anyone planned for them to suck, not because anyone is evil, but because the convergence of rational, self-interested behaviors among all the players produces, with mathematical inevitability, the institution we observe. Each player is doing exactly what is rational for them. The aggregate result is a system that fails at every one of its stated purposes while succeeding spectacularly at its actual purpose, which is the comfortable preservation of existing arrangements. The outsider who tried to reform such a system was not opposed because he failed. He was opposed because he threatened the convergence point. He tried to build a school that served the brochure rather than the players. The players, sensing the threat to their convergence, expelled him. They had to. He was the foreign organ. The body rejected him exactly as bodies are designed to reject foreign organs. This is the first great lesson of game theory. Institutions do not produce what they claim to produce. Institutions produce whatever lies at the convergence point of the actual interests of their actual players. If you want to understand any institution, ignore the mission statement. Find the players. Find their real incentives. Find the convergence point. The convergence point is the institution. Chapter 6. The Deeper Game. There is a question that emerges from this analysis, and it is the right question to ask. Why are these players the way they are? Why do parents prioritize face over substance? Why do teachers settle for survival rather than greatness? Why do administrators protect the wealthy rather than the talented? Why do students chase popularity rather than knowledge? The shallow answer is that this is just human nature. People are like that. The shallow answer is wrong. The deep answer is that each of these players is themselves a player in larger games. They are not free-floating individuals choosing their behavior. They are nodes in a vast network of overlapping games, and the strategies they pursue inside the school are the strategies that maximize their position in the larger games they cannot escape. Consider the parents. A parent is not only a parent is also a son or daughter with siblings to compete against. A parent is also a colleague, embedded in a workplace where social standing depends on 100 subtle markers. A parent is also a member of an extended family, where the achievements of children are currency in the perpetual contest for status among aunts, uncles, cousins, in-laws. When a parent makes a decision about their child's education, the parent is not optimizing for the child's intellectual development. The parent is optimizing for the parent's standing in the games the parent is required to play. If a parent allows her child to pursue art instead of finance, the parent's siblings will whisper that she has failed. If a parent allows her child to take an unconventional path, the parent's colleagues will conclude that the parent is irresponsible. If a parent does not produce a child who can be displayed at family gatherings as evidence of the parent's success, the parent's status in the family network declines. So the parent makes the decision that protects the parent, not the decision that serves the child. And the parent does this without ever consciously recognizing that this is what she is doing, because the calculus is invisible, automatic, embedded in the very texture of social life. The same logic applies to teachers who are embedded in professional networks where reformers are seen as troublemakers. The same logic applies to administrators who are embedded in industry networks where boat rockers do not get promoted. The same logic applies to students who are embedded in peer networks where the truly studious are mocked and the truly creative are isolated. Every player is playing many games at once. The school is only one of them, and often not the most important. The behavior of every player is the strategy that optimizes across all the games they are simultaneously playing, with heavy weighting toward the games that matter most to their survival. And what people fear most, more than failure, more than poverty, more even than death, is the experience of being expelled from the group. Ostracism is the original human punishment because for most of our evolutionary history, ostracism meant death. The brain is wired to avoid ostracism at almost any cost. This is why systems are so difficult to change. To behave differently from the convergence point is to risk ostracism. To risk ostracism is to risk everything. The reformer who tried to build a better school did not merely face institutional resistance. He faced the cumulative weight of every player's terror of being expelled from their own networks. Parents who supported him would be whispered about by other parents. Teachers who embraced his methods would be marginalized by other teachers. Administrators who backed him would be passed over by other administrators. The pressure was not personal, it was structural, and the structure won, as the structure almost always wins. This is the deeper game beneath the school game. And the deeper game beneath that is the structure of society itself, which is what we must now examine. Chapter 7. The Marshmallow Test. Revisited. For decades, the field of educational psychology has been dominated by three influential theories of success. Each of these theories has produced best-selling books, motivational speeches, and entire industries of self-help. Each of these theories is, in important ways, wrong. The first theory comes from Walter Mischel, a psychologist at Columbia, who in the late 1960s conducted what would become the most famous experiment in the history of his discipline. Mischel invited young children, ages 4 and 5, into a room. He sat with each child, made conversation, established rapport. Then he announced that he had to step out for a few minutes. He placed a marshmallow on the table in front of the child. He explained the rules. The child could eat the marshmallow immediately if she wished. But if she waited until Mischel returned, she would receive 2 marshmallows instead of 1. Then Mischel left. Behind a one-way mirror, he watched. Some children seized the marshmallow within seconds. Others struggled visibly, leaning away from the temptation, covering their eyes, singing to themselves. Some held out for the full 15 minutes and received the promised reward. Mischel then tracked these children for the next 40 years. The ones who had waited, who had demonstrated what he called delayed gratification, turned out to do better in school. They had higher test scores, more stable careers, better relationships, lower rates of substance abuse, better physical health, longer lives. The ones who had eaten the marshmallow immediately showed, in the aggregate, worse outcomes across nearly every measurable domain. The conclusion seemed obvious. Self-control predicts success. Therefore, schools should teach self-control. An entire industry of curriculum reform was built on this insight. The second theory comes from Carol Dweck at Stanford, whose book Mindset became one of the most widely cited works in educational thinking of the past 3 decades. Dweck argued that students fall into 2 categories. Those with a fixed mindset believe that intelligence is innate and unchangeable. When they fail, they conclude that they are stupid, and they give up. Those with a growth mindset believe that intelligence can be developed through effort. When they fail, they conclude that they need to try harder, and they persist. Resilience, Dweck argued, is the master skill. Teach resilience, and you teach success. The third theory comes from Anders Ericsson, the Swedish psychologist who studied elite performers, athletes, and musicians and chess masters. Erikson concluded that what separated the great from the merely good was not talent, but a specific type of practice he called deliberate practice. Deliberate practice meant identifying weaknesses, designing exercises to address those weaknesses, executing those exercises with full attention, evaluating the results, and adjusting. It was strategic, reflective, and ruthlessly honest about one's own limitations. Erikson's work was popularized as the 10,000 hours rule, but his actual insight was deeper. The hours matter only if the hours are deliberate. Mindless practice produces mindless mediocrity. 3 theories: self-control, resilience, self-reflection. Schools across the world have built entire programs around these concepts. And yet, when these programs are administered to struggling students, they almost universally fail. The bad student who is taught self-control does not become a good student. The struggling student who is given a growth mindset workshop does not begin to grow. The disengaged student who is trained in deliberate practice does not become engaged. Why? Because correlation is not causation. This is the single most important principle in the social sciences, and it is the principle most consistently ignored. The fact that successful people exhibit self-control does not mean that self-control produced their success. The reverse may be true. Success may produce self-control. The fact that successful people exhibit a growth mindset does not mean the growth mindset produced their success. Success may produce the growth mindset. The fact that successful people engage in deliberate practice does not mean deliberate practice produced their success. Success may produce the conditions under which deliberate practice becomes possible. If you wake up at 4 in the morning, you will not become a successful CEO. But if you are a successful CEO, you will probably wake up at 4 in the morning because you are excited about your work, because you have meetings across multiple time zones, because the rhythms of your life have organized themselves around your achievements. The waking does not produce the success. The success produces the waking. If we apply this insight to Michel's marshmallow test, something startling becomes visible. The marshmallow test is not a test of self-control. It is a test of trust. It is a test of whether the child believes that the adult will keep her promise. Consider a child from a stable, prosperous family. When her parents promise a trip to Disneyland next summer, the trip happens. When her parents promise pizza on Friday, the pizza arrives. When her parents promise that they will be at her recital, they are at her recital. By the age of 4, this child has been conditioned by hundreds of fulfilled promises to believe that promises are real. So when a strange researcher promises 2 marshmallows in 15 minutes, the child waits. Of course she waits. The promise is credible because every promise in her life has been credible. Now consider a child from a precarious, struggling family. Her parents have repeatedly promised things that did not happen. The promised vacation was canceled because the money ran out. The promised toy never materialized because there was a medical emergency. The promised parent did not come to the recital because the night shift was extended. By the age of 4, this child has learned that promises are not real. Promises are stories adults tell to manage children. So when a strange researcher promises 2 marshmallows in 15 minutes, the child eats the marshmallow. Of course she does. The marshmallow in her hand is real. The second marshmallow is a fiction. She is not impulsive. She is rational. She is responding correctly to the world she has actually lived in. The marshmallow test does not measure self-control. It measures the credibility of the adult world as experienced by the child. And the credibility of the adult world in the experience of the child is determined almost entirely by the resources and stability of her family. Rich children inherit a trustworthy world. Poor children inherit an untrustworthy world. Each child responds rationally to her inheritance. And then we sort the children by their rational responses, and we declare the rich children to have superior character. This is not psychology. This is ideology dressed up as psychology. The same analysis dismantles the other two theories. Resilience requires the belief that help will come if you fall. Rich children grow up in environments where help always comes. Poor children grow up in environments where help often does not. The rich child is resilient because resilience is rewarded in her ecosystem. The poor child is not resilient because resilience is not rewarded in hers. Resilience is not a virtue. It is an adaptation to an environment that makes resilience worthwhile. Self-reflection requires the psychological space to look inward without being immediately overwhelmed by pain. Rich children have that space. Poor children whose inner lives are dominated by stress, hunger, fear, and instability do not. Asking a poor child to engage in deliberate practice to reflect honestly on her weaknesses is like asking someone who is drowning to study swimming theory. The cognitive bandwidth required for the exercise has already been consumed by the emergency of being alive. Self-control, resilience, and self-reflection are not the causes of success. They are the symptoms of having grown up in conditions where success was already likely. Teaching them to children who do not have those conditions is not merely useless. It is cruel because it suggests that the failure of those children is a moral failure, when in fact it is a structural one. So the question becomes inescapable. Why do rich children grow up in conditions that produce success, and why do poor children grow up in conditions that do not? Because if we can understand that, we can understand why schools, no matter how reformed, will never close the gap. The gap is not produced by schools. The gap is delivered to schools fully formed, and schools merely ratify it. Chapter 8. Two Worlds, Two Strategies. The difference between rich parents and poor parents is not, fundamentally, a difference in love. Poor parents love their children fiercely. Rich parents are often distant. The difference is not even fundamentally a difference in intelligence or virtue. Rich parents can be foolish. Poor parents can be wise. The difference is strategic. Rich parents and poor parents are preparing their children for two different games, and the strategies that optimize for one game are precisely the strategies that fail in the other. Researchers have documented three consistent differences in how rich families and poor families raise their children. The first is vocabulary. Rich parents speak to their children far more, using longer sentences and a more varied lexicon. By the age of 3, children from prosperous homes have heard tens of millions more words than children from struggling homes. The cumulative effect on linguistic competence is staggering, and by the time school begins, the gap is already nearly impossible to close. The second difference is attitude. Rich parents tend to explain. When a rich child touches a hot stove and burns her hand, the rich parent kneels down and says, "Listen, you made a mistake, and that's okay, but let me explain why we don't touch the stove. Heat causes burns. Burns cause pain. Pain requires us to go to the doctor. The doctor's office is not where we want to spend our afternoon. Do you understand?" The child nods, and the explanation is filed away in a developing mind that is being trained to expect explanations from the adult world. Poor parents tend to command. The same scenario produces a sharp slap and a single sentence. "Don't ever do that again, or I'll beat you." Pretty simple, effective in the short term, devastating in the long term, because the rich child learns that the adult world is reasonable. Adults explain. Adults can be questioned. Adults respect the child enough to share the why. When the rich child arrives at school and meets her teacher, she smiles, she approaches, she engages. The teacher smiles back. A relationship is formed. The child becomes a favorite. The poor child learns that the adult world is dangerous. Adults command. Adults cannot be questioned. Adults do not explain because their authority does not require explanation. When the poor child arrives at school and meets her teacher, she does not smile. She does not make eye contact. She is wary. The teacher reads this wariness as defiance, or as low intelligence, or as the early sign of a problem child. A different relationship is formed, or no relationship at all. The child becomes a target. Neither parenting style is irrational. The rich parent is preparing the child for a world in which adults will respect her, in which negotiation is the dominant social skill, in which the ability to make a reasoned argument will determine her career. The poor parent is preparing the child for a world in which adults will not respect her, in which negotiation will get her hurt, in which the ability to obey instantly may save her life. The poor parent's command-driven style is not a parenting failure. It is a survival skill being transmitted to a child who will need it. The third difference is stability. Rich parents can afford to keep their promises. They say they will take the child to the beach on Saturday, and they take the child to the beach on Saturday. The promised reward is delivered. The world becomes a place where adult words have predictive value. Poor parents cannot reliably keep their promises, not because they do not want to, but because their lives are subject to volatility that rich parents do not experience. The shift is extended. The car breaks down. The relative who was going to babysit cancels. The check did not clear. So the promised beach trip is canceled again, and the child learns again that adult words are not predictive of adult actions. This is why the marshmallow test produces the results it does. By the age of 4, the rich child has been conditioned to trust the future because the future has been reliably delivered. By the age of 4, the poor child has been conditioned to distrust the future because the future has been a continuous disappointment. When the researcher promises 2 marshmallows in 15 minutes, the rich child trusts the promise and waits. The poor child distrusts the promise and eats. Both are responding correctly to the worlds they have actually inhabited. And this is why, no matter how brilliantly we reform schools, the gap persists. Because the gap is not produced by schools. The gap is produced by the structural difference between 2 worlds, 2 ecosystems, 2 games. Schools merely receive the children that these games have already shaped. By the time the child arrives in the classroom, the foundational architecture of her relationship to learning, to authority, to delayed reward, to her own future, has already been set. Chapter 9. Why the system persists. If the system is so unjust, if the gap between rich and poor is so structurally embedded, if even well-meaning reformers are crushed by the convergence of player interests, why does the system not collapse? Why is there not constant revolution? Why do the poor not rise up and tear down the arrangements that ensure their continued exclusion? The answer is that the system is, in its own brutal way, stable. The poor accept their position because the strategies their families have developed are well adapted to their position. To rebel would be to abandon the strategies that allow them to survive within their networks. To rebel would mean ostracism, and ostracism is the one thing the brain is wired to avoid above all else. But systems do not collapse from the bottom. They collapse from the middle, and they collapse from the top. This is one of the great unspoken truths of historical analysis. Every revolution in human history without exception has been led by people who already had a great deal, but believed they should have more. Not the destitute, the aspirational, not the truly poor, the frustrated near elite. The Chinese Revolution was not led by peasants. It was led by Mao Zedong, by Zhou Enlai, by Deng Xiaoping. These were not peasants. These were the urban-educated, frustrated elite, men who had been to school, who had read books, who believed they should be in charge of the country and were not. The peasants provided the bodies. The aspirational elite provided the direction. The French Revolution was led by lawyers, journalists, intellectuals, prosperous bourgeois who looked at the aristocracy and concluded that the wrong people were in power. The American Revolution was led by wealthy merchants and planters who resented being subordinate to a distant king. The Russian Revolution was led by displaced intellectuals. Every great upheaval traces back, when you examine it closely, to the same pattern. The truly powerless are too exhausted to revolt. The truly powerful have no reason to. It is the people in between, the people with enough resources to imagine a different arrangement and enough frustration to demand it, who set the world on fire. So the question of social stability comes down to a simple metric. Is the system producing too many aspirational elites for the number of elite positions available? When the answer is no, when there is room at the top for those who claim it, the system absorbs the ambitious and remains stable. This was America in the 1950s. This was China in the 1980s. The talented could rise. The promise of mobility kept the talented loyal to the system that promised them. When the answer is yes, when there are too many aspirational elites and not enough elite positions, the surplus aspirants become revolutionaries. They form coalitions with the poor. They articulate grievances. They demand a game reset, and eventually they get one, often by destroying the existing order entirely. This is the dynamic that historians call elite overproduction, and it is the master key to understanding why apparently stable societies suddenly collapse. The elite reproduce. Their children expect elite positions, but the number of elite positions does not grow as fast as the number of elite children, so a surplus accumulates, the surplus competes, the competition becomes vicious. Eventually, the losers of the elite competition do what losers of elite competitions always do. They look for allies among the dispossessed, and they overthrow the table. Apply this to schools, and the picture becomes uncomfortably clear. Elite parents do not actually want a system of universal opportunity. They want a system in which their children inherit elite positions, so they corrupt the system from within. They demand easy grades for their own children. They demand admissions advantages. They demand legacy preferences. They demand that the system, which claims to reward merit, actually rewards birth. And the system complies because the convergence point of player interests requires it. When social mobility exists, the system is stable and societies prosper. When social mobility is choked off, the system becomes brittle and eventually it shatters. The history of every civilization is the history of this oscillation. Rise, hardening, crack, collapse, reset. Rise, hardening, crack, collapse, reset. The cycle has no exception. There is no civilization that escapes it. There is only the question of which phase you happen to be born into. Chapter 10. The Examination. Consider the Keiju, the Imperial Chinese Civil Service examination, which existed in various forms for over 1,000 years. At its inception, the Keiju was one of the most remarkable institutions in human history. Any man, regardless of birth, could in principle present himself for examination. If he passed, he became a civil servant, an official, a member of the governing class. The examination produced a meritocratic elite drawn from across the vast Chinese society that governed the empire for centuries. For the first generation, the system worked. The brightest peasants rose. The empire was governed by genuine talent. The energy released by this mobility produced golden ages of art, technology, philosophy, and administration. For the second generation, problems began. The successful officials, having risen by merit, naturally wanted their own children to succeed. So they trained their children intensively for the examination, gave them every advantage, hired the best tutors. The examination was still nominally open to all, but the children of officials, with their inherited resources and connections, dominated the results. Mobility narrowed. For the third generation, the dominant families began to corrupt the examination directly. Bribes were paid. Results were arranged. The official ideology of merit continued to be celebrated, but the operational reality was that the same families produced examination success generation after generation. By the time the system reached its terminal decay, talented men from outside the established families found themselves systematically excluded. The most famous of these excluded talents was Hong Xiuquan, who failed the imperial examinations repeatedly. Frustrated, humiliated, and possessed of immense energy that had no legitimate outlet, he eventually came to believe he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He started a religious movement. The movement became a rebellion. The rebellion became the Taiping Civil War, which killed tens of millions of people and effectively destroyed imperial China. If the Keiju had not been corrupted, if Hong Xiuquan had been allowed to pass the examination on the basis of his obvious intelligence, he would have become a respectable mid-level official and tens of millions of people would have lived. Instead, the elite hoarded their positions, and the hoarding produced a revolutionary, and the revolutionary produced a catastrophe. The same pattern produced Mao Zedong, who as a young man found that the path of advancement available to his parents' generation had been closed by the time he came of age. The Keiju had been abolished. The new opportunities of the modern era were monopolized by the same hardened elite that had monopolized the old opportunities. So Mao did what frustrated aspirational elites always do. He started a revolution. He killed millions. He reset the game. This is the price societies pay when they fail to maintain mobility. The talented who are excluded do not quietly accept their exclusion. They burn the table down. And the rest of us, who would have preferred mere mediocrity, get the apocalypse instead. So when you look at the modern educational system and you see that the children of the wealthy attend schools with abundant resources and inspiring teachers and creative freedom, while the children of the poor attend schools with worn-out buildings and demoralized teachers and rigid discipline, do not think you are merely looking at injustice. You are looking at the preconditions for the next collapse. You are looking at elite overproduction in the making. You are looking at the hardening that precedes the crack. This is the dynamic that schools embody and conceal. The official story is meritocracy. The operational story is sorting. The deeper story is the slow accumulation of grievance among those who are sorted wrongly. And the final story, the one that history teaches with weary repetition, is that this grievance will eventually find its voice. And when it does, the comfortable arrangements of the comfortable classes will be swept away. Chapter 11. The Few Who Escape. There are exceptions. There are always exceptions. The poor child who becomes a billionaire, the immigrant who becomes a senator, the peasant who becomes a professor at Yale. These stories are told and retold because they are seductive, because they suggest that the system is open after all, because they reassure the comfortable that their comfort is deserved. The exceptions exist, but they are exceptions, and they require something that most people, rich or poor, do not have. They require the willingness to abandon one's community. The poor person who succeeds, in nearly every case, achieves that success by leaving the network into which she was born. She moves, she immigrates, she severs ties. She enters environments where her old strategies no longer work, where she must invent new ones, where she will be lonely for many years. This is enormously difficult. It is psychologically brutal. The brain, as we have established, is wired to fear ostracism above all things, and voluntary self-ostracism is the price of escape. The poor person who tries to succeed within her network usually fails. The network rewards conformity, not ambition. The network is calibrated for survival, not flourishing. To ask the network to support unusual achievement is to ask the network to do something it was not designed to do. So the talented poor person who stays within her community is, more often than not, ground down by it. War has historically been one of the few mechanisms that allowed the talented poor to escape. In a war, a brilliant strategist can rise from corporal to general in a matter of years. Many of history's great social mobility events were wars. But war is also extremely likely to kill you, which makes it a poor recommended strategy. Marriage has historically been another. The clever poor person, Particularly, the clever poor woman can marry into a higher station. This was, for most of human history, the primary mobility strategy available to women, and it remains operative today, though we pretend it does not. Migration has been the third. The talented person who moves from a closed society to an open one can find opportunities her birthplace would never have offered her. The American immigrant story is largely the story of this strategy. But migration is high risk. The migrant who arrives in a new country with nothing usually remains with nothing. Only a minority succeed, and they tend to be those who combined unusual talent with unusual willingness to gamble everything on the move. What unites all of these escape strategies is risk. To escape your station, you must take risks that the people around you are not willing to take. You must be, in essence, willing to lose everything. Most people are not willing to lose everything for the entirely rational reason that losing everything is bad. So most people stay. And most people, having stayed, remain in the station into which they were born. The exceptions are real. They are also rare. And they do not invalidate the rule. They confirm it because the conditions required to become an exception are themselves so unusual that the system as a whole remains exactly as stratified as we have described. The exception that we celebrate is the exception that makes the rule tolerable. Without the occasional rags to riches story, the structure of inequality would be intolerable to those it crushes. With the occasional rags to riches story, the structure becomes bearable because everyone can tell herself that she might be the next exception. The system requires its mythology of mobility precisely because its operational reality is immobility. The myth is the lubricant that allows the machine to keep turning. Chapter 12. What this means for you. We have arrived at the moment of practical consequence. You have followed the analysis. You see the players, you see the convergence point, you see the deep structures that produce schools, that produce parenting styles, that produce the persistent gap between rich and poor. The natural question is, what now? What does one do with this knowledge? The first thing to understand is that you cannot reform the system from inside the system using the system's own tools. The reformer who tried to build a better school was crushed not because his ideas were wrong, but because his ideas threatened the convergence point. Anyone who attempts the same thing anywhere will be crushed in the same way, unless they are willing to operate outside the convergence point or to gradually shift it from the edges. The second thing to understand is that incremental reform is possible, but only when it works with the player's actual interests rather than against them. If you can design a reform that makes powerful parents happier, that makes teachers' lives easier, that produces better outcomes for administrators' careers, the reform will be adopted. If you design a reform that threatens any of those things, no matter how brilliant, no matter how morally correct, the reform will be expelled. The reformer must be a strategist of the convergence point, not a prophet against it. The third thing to understand is that as a parent, you have more leverage over your child's outcomes than the school will ever have. The marshmallow test results were determined by age 4 before any school had touched the child. The vocabulary gap was determined by the words spoken in the home, not by any lesson plan. The trust in the future was established by the parent's reliability or unreliability, not by any teacher's character curriculum. If you want to give your child the foundations of success, you must build those foundations at home. The school will not do it for you. The school cannot. The fourth thing to understand is that as a young person, you have a choice that the structures around you would prefer to hide from you. You can play the game that has been set for you, the game of grades and prestige and conformity to your network's expectations, and you will achieve roughly the outcomes the structure has assigned to you. Or you can step partially outside the game and develop yourself in ways the game does not measure. You can read books that were not assigned. You can master skills your teachers do not teach. You can question premises your textbooks present as settled. You can prepare yourself for a different game. Doing this will be lonely. Your peers will not understand. Your teachers may resent it. Your parents will worry the cost is real, but the alternative is to allow the convergence point to shape you into one of its products, and the products of the convergence point are not, on average, happy people. They are anxious, status-seeking, intellectually stunted adults who spend their lives chasing markers of success that fail to satisfy them when achieved. If that is the destination, the journey is not worth the cost. There is no glory in arriving at the place the system has designed for you. The fifth thing to understand is that the system itself is not eternal. Every system that has ever existed has eventually been swept away by the dynamics we have described. Elite overproduction accumulates. Mobility chokes. The grievances of the excluded build. Eventually, something snaps. The schools that seem so permanent today are not permanent. The arrangements that seem so unshakable will shake. The question is not whether the current system will end. The question is whether it will end through gradual reform or through catastrophic collapse. And the second is, historically, much more common than the first. We are, by every available measure, in a phase of accelerating elite overproduction across the developed world. Too many credentialed young people compete for too few elite positions. The frustrated surplus accumulates. The wealthy hoard the available positions for their own children with increasing ferocity. The political institutions that were supposed to manage these tensions have become tools of the hoarders rather than mediators between competing interests. The pattern that produced the Taiping Rebellion, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution is visible in different costumes across many contemporary societies. This is not a prediction of doom. It is a description of dynamics. Dynamics can be redirected. Hoarding can be reversed. Mobility can be restored. But these things require choices, and choices require honest analysis, and honest analysis is exactly what the convergence point of every existing institution is structured to prevent. This is why a clear understanding of game theory matters, not as an academic exercise, but as a survival tool. The world that produced you is not the world you must accept. The strategies that shaped your parents are not the strategies you must inherit. The schools that processed you do not have the last word on what you can become. You can see the convergence point. You can step around it. You can build a different game, perhaps only for yourself, perhaps only inside your own family, perhaps in some small corner of the world where you have influence. But you must see clearly first. You must abandon the comforting lies the brochures have told you. You must accept that institutions are not what they say they are. You must accept that the people around you are playing games they themselves do not consciously understand. You must accept that you have been one of those people, and you must decide whether you will continue to be. Chapter 13. The truth beneath the truth. There is a final layer to this analysis, the layer that game theory always eventually reveals if you follow it long enough. The truth beneath the truth. The truth beneath the schools is that schools are not really about learning. The truth beneath the parenting strategies is that parenting strategies are not really about children. The truth beneath the entire elaborate apparatus of education and family and social mobility is that it is all a vast game of status played by adults who are themselves the products of earlier games, optimizing for outcomes they did not choose and often cannot even articulate. Every person you have ever met, including yourself, is a node in this game. The teacher who seemed so wise was playing a game. The parent who seemed so loving was playing a game. The administrator who seemed so committed was playing a game. The friend who seemed so loyal was playing a game. This is not cynicism. It is observation. The games are real. The relationships within the games can be real. But the games operate continuously beneath the surface of everything, and the people who recognize the games have, throughout history, possessed an enormous advantage over the people who do not. Most people will never recognize the games. They will live and die inside the convergence point, playing the assigned role with the assigned reward. Unable to see why they were never quite happy. Unable to understand why the achievements that were supposed to bring satisfaction did not. They will produce children, and the children will repeat the cycle with minor variations. A few people in every generation see through. They notice the gap between the brochure and the reality. They notice that the players are not what they appear to be. They notice that they themselves have been one of the players, performing a role that was not chosen. And those few people, having noticed, face a decision. They can stay inside the game and use their new awareness merely to play it more skillfully, becoming a slightly more sophisticated version of the same product the convergence point produces. Or they can begin to live differently, to raise their children differently, to pursue work differently, to form relationships differently, to define success in terms that were not handed to them by the convergence point. This is the choice that has, in every era, separated the merely successful from the genuinely free. And it is the choice that this analysis, if it has done its work, has placed in front of you. You can close this audiobook and continue as before. The convergence point will continue to operate. Schools will continue to suck. The rich will continue to stay rich. The dynamics we have described will continue to grind through human lives with the cold efficiency they have displayed for millennia. Or you can take what you have heard and begin to use it. Not to overthrow the system, which you almost certainly cannot do, but to step partially outside it. To see your own behavior with new clarity, to examine the games you are playing without realizing you are playing them, to ask whether the reward you are pursuing is actually a reward you want, to consider whether the person you are becoming is a person you respect, to raise your children, if you have children, in a way that gives them what the rich children get, not the easy grades and the inflated achievements, but the linguistic richness, the explained world, the dependable promises, the trust in their own future. This is what game theory, properly understood, ultimately offers. Not certainty, not control, not victory. Game theory offers awareness. And awareness, in a world structured to prevent it, is the rarest and most valuable thing a person can possess. The schools will not give it to you. Your parents could not give it to you. The institutions around you are designed to keep you from acquiring it. But you have just been given it, by the analysis you have followed across these chapters, by the willingness you have shown to consider that the things you were told were lies, that the structures you trusted were rigged, that the failures you blamed on yourself were largely the consequence of systems older than your grandparents. You see clearly now. The convergence point is visible to you. The game is exposed. What you do next is, for once, actually up to you.
I know Kung Fu.